waiting room and just let them in progressively if they, for some reason, aren't in.
I know. How's things, though?
Yeah, good. All good. Got in quick little hour of power this morning. Crunched out some
A,
time on the treadmill in
a
prep for this.
run or
Yeah. Just indoor. I don't do the bike. So hour on the treadmill, trying to get some stuff done so that I can sort of get on with the day for the rest of the day. But
who
we got,
knows?
I think,
Can't actually
three.
remember the last time I ran on a treadmill.
Yeah, it's too frequent here, but my ankle is still 98%, so it responds better to the treadmill. Got
Don't know if I
Lisbon
won't tell
up
you
there.
where I went running this afternoon.
Where if it wasn't the Bluey, was it the Blueies?
No, it was just Manly Beach down the front, all the way along to Shelley and then back, and it was quite delightful actually. Just shirt off and just bit of sunshine, afternoon sunshine. It's glory.
I've forgotten what sunshine is or looks
Yes.
like. Um, but we'll get there.
Very good.
Got
Yeah,
Lisbon
it
half
is
marathon.
actually cooling down here, so and it's been a bit wet, so it's not all glorious down under.
Yeah, but,
We
it's
brought
quite.
the rain, or Taylor Swift brought the rain. She's playing in Sydney at the moment, and
Oh, I
there's
know. I might.
it's like a Swift mania in
I
Australia at the
know.
moment. It's crazy.
I've been contacted to get on radio, so I might be on Hughesy's show on Friday morning about this.
Really?
Yeah,
Talking about Taylor
I,
Swift.
yeah, about Taylor Swift and her training program. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that happened or how this person got my email address, but I've been contacted to do that. So it's either that or a elaborate ruse, which could also be the case, knowing some of my friends. So
That's pretty cool, though. I have no idea what her training program is, but I'm sure it's pretty intense. She's looks fairly physically fit. So she played. I think she played for 2.5 or 3 hours the other night for Melbourne. So
yeah, three
pretty
and a
cool
half hours.
in front of the largest crowd she's ever played in, which I found quite amazing that she's never played in front of more than 100,000 people.
Yeah, I think that's good play from the MCG. Fill
Yeah,
the stands and then put people on the oval and just call it the most.
yeah,
Um,
exactly. Well, should we get going?
yeah, are we recording or do we have to hit record? I think if you can hit,
Um,
I
oh,
think we need to
sorry.
record just so that other people are able
Yeah, let
to
me
get it
just
post.
see. Should be recording. Um, it is recording at this point, so I can stop it and then start again if you want.
No, that's fine.
You sure?
Yep,
Okay,
that's
it's recording and then we can edit afterwards.
yeah, of course.
Perfect. Let's go.
Well, firstly, thanks everyone for joining us for the webinar. Appreciate your time, and for those who are watching back on video, apologies for time zone stuff, but that's the beauties of working across Europe, Australia, US, all of those things. So, obviously, thanks to Fuelin for sort of hosting this and hosting me from Super Sapiens. So, for those who don't know, I'm sure you all know Fuelin, but if we want Scott, you can go a couple of minutes on that. But just before we do that, Super Sapiens, who I work for, is a continuous glucose monitoring company for athletes. We work with the likes of Billy Kipchoge amongst others. So, kind of then there's sort of me that sits in there. I'm director of applied science and content, so I host our podcast for those who happen to listen, of which Scott's been a guest, and that's an episode you should definitely go back and listen to. I also work with some of our athletes, do some of our marketing, and I run marathons myself. So a lot of the data in this is actually my data as well. So we can talk a bit about that. And I run, geez, I can't remember how many with Super Sapiens now, at least 3, maybe 4 marathons using Super Sapiens. So I've got quite a bit of data in training and racing. So happy to answer those questions. I'll sort of hand over to Scott, talk a bit about Fuel, and then we can talk about the data from his Sydney marathon and some of my marathons as well.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Dave. Thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, I do appreciate the time time zone difficulties with handling some of this, but obviously on the watching it back, hopefully it still brings a lot of value. So Fuelin is the world's first training-based nutrition app. What that means is that we sync directly with your training program. So whether you're with Training Peaks, TriDot, Final Surge, or if you're still with today's plan, we sync directly with that and provide a truly personalized nutrition program that is built around the training that you or your coach is providing to yourself. So everything is sort of broken down into meals. We use a simple traffic light system to denote what types of carb or what amounts of carbohydrates you should be consuming. And we also break down the individual macros, so protein and fat for every snack and meal. And that's presented in a day-by-day fashion and delivered to you via an iOS app. Unlike David, I have not run multiple marathons. I've done one marathon, and we're going to discuss that in this. It was last year in a very hot Sydney environment. I have done an half Ironman as well. My background is predominantly in intermittent sports, so I've also been lucky enough to work with the America's Cup with Oracle Team USA, the Toronto Maple Leafs in the NHL, Leicester Tigers and Harlequins in the Premiership Rugby, and England cricket with their Lions when I previously lived in England for close to 13 years. And now I'm back in Sydney on the Northern Beaches. And yeah, I'm co-founder of Fuelin. So yeah, be sure to check us out. And hopefully tonight gives just a bit of an insight, I guess, into what continuous glucose monitoring does, I guess, during a marathon, and what insights hopefully that you can gain from it.
Awesome.
Cool.
Let's get going. I guess probably the first thing we should touch on is carbohydrate loading. Of course, this isn't a continuous glucose monitoring thing specifically, and actually you can see here Scott's kindly put in his carb loading from the Fuelin app. So this is what it obviously looks like. I've got some of my carb load in terms of just what I ate in a coming slide, so you can see that. But I guess this is where marathon fueling starts, and Scott, you'll talk a bit more to this than I will. But I think one of the misconceptions of carb loading is that it's a pasta party the night before. I think if that's your viewpoint, you've missed the boat. It's much more than that. It's much more planned. It's much more extensive. I tend to use a shorter, sort of more intensive load than you do, Scott. You sort of use a bit more of a sort of a longer one that's a little bit less unpleasant. I'm probably the glutton for punishment and go for a sort of 36-hour, really brutal one.
Oh no, that's what we tend to do as well with Fuelin. So we'll definitely load up 24 hours before. So in this case, like, yeah, the way we deem it is a minimum of 8 grams per kilo body weight, anywhere up to 12 grams per kilo body weight. But we'll definitely run that 24 hours before the race. 36, 48 hours before, we'll generally prescribe something like between 6 and 7 grams. So not a huge amount, just higher amounts of carb, but definitely that carb load very much in line with what you've done. I think my total amount, so I aimed for around just over 8 grams per kilo body weight for this marathon, which was probably on the lower end, and probably for my next marathon, I'll probably shoot higher, 10 to 12 grams where you did. I know for my 70.3, because that was sort of in the 5 to 5 and a bit hours, I shot for actually 10 grams per kilo body weight. So to be honest, I don't know why I actually shot for a little bit lower for this race, but that's what I did. But yeah, I can talk people through what we've here. So as you said, we've got some screenshots, and you can see my totals up the top. So 180 grams of protein, 75 grams of fat, and 650 grams of carbs throughout the day. I did some very light exercise, which I didn't fuel within. And so my total calories were about 4,000 calories for that day. I didn't shy away from protein. I know some people will shy away from protein leading in. I didn't do that. Yeah, I don't, honestly, there's no science to say why you should pull away from it. And if anything, I think you should be taking on probably protein just to support, you know, having amino acids going around your body, you know, support any muscle damage, and probably as much as anything, it's going to support you in terms of recovery after the race. Fat is there just to make up the calories pretty much. Potentially I could have taken a little bit more, but I kept it a little bit lower just from a GI perspective. I guess the biggest thing that what we try to emphasize for a carb load is trying to keep fiber down to as low as possible. And that is always hard with a carbohydrate intake as high as this and even higher, as you'll see with Dave. So I guess what you end up doing is you tend to consume what most people would call bad foods. So kids cereals, very refined carbohydrates, think ultra processed and processed foods become very much the foods that are often consumed for a carbohydrate load because caloric density, in particular carbohydrate density, is very high, but overall bulk is very low and fiber is obviously kept to a minimum, hence why ultra processed and processed foods aren't regarded as necessarily healthy. But for the purpose of carbohydrate loading, they serve a very good purpose and they're certainly the foods of choice. My particular foods, and I know Dave's got a very extensive list and it's very good, but I typically keep it very simple. I tend to eat a combination of savory or sweet boiled rice. So I either eat it with yogurt and some blueberries and maple syrup, or for my savory, it's usually sweet chili sauce and chicken thighs. And I tend to rinse, repeat that throughout the entire day. I do eat some bananas throughout the day as well, just from a fructose perspective. I also use around 100 grams of maltodextrin in a 1 liter bottle that I tend to drink between, and we do this a lot with our professional and age group athletes. We'll tend to get them drinking, say, 100 grams in a liter because maltodextrin has zero taste and zero sweetness. So it's actually very easy to consume. Drink that between as a mid-morning snack and then go through the rest of the day and just make sure you're hitting your total amounts. For me, I do believe weighing your food for the carbohydrate load is pretty important, especially if you're eating foods that you're actually preparing at home. Obviously, if you're going down more the packaged and ultra processed foods, then using the labels is certainly fine. But I would recommend tracking it and tracking in something like Fuelin. Fuelin does, or MyFitnessPal or Lose It. You can see here that we sync with MyFitnessPal. So a lot of you can see where I've tracked lunch and dinner and some of my snacks in MyFitnessPal to ensure that I'm actually hitting my targets above. And so, yeah, that's where I got to. I was a little bit under on my protein for the day, a little bit under my fat, but, focused predominantly on my carbohydrates.
Yeah, and I think the challenge, I sort of touched on this before, the challenge of the carb load is that just volumes. So you talked about drinking calories. It's the strategy I use. The other one that people use is just candy. Because
Yep.
as you said, like the ultra processed stuff, like you just need the carbohydrates. And that's why I think people shy away from protein and fat. It's just like, it's just hard because they're so
Yep.
satiating compared to processed carbs. The fiber stuff, yeah, I agree. GI upset is a thing. Like for context, I mean, this is actually a really good teaching point, learning point for people, or example is you were at home doing this, Scott. So you got to weigh your food, do all that, prepare your own food. I was in Boston. I couldn't have been further from home. So I had to carb load with whatever I could get hold of. Sort of while I was out and about, trying to live a relatively normal life, go pick up bib numbers, etc. I think, or perhaps not the day before, but go sort of check out some things. So if you click the next slide, Scott, you'll
Yep.
see just a list of everything I ate. You can see I did probably one day in earnest, the race day -1, April 17th. I sort of started to do a little bit more on April 15th, but it wasn't a lot there. It's probably higher than my normal intake. And then 16th was a bit of a go as well, but the real one was on race day -1. Of course, you can see here I hit 8.6 there, but that's only of known carbohydrates. There was a bunch of food there that I had no idea about. And the thing that people always freak out about when I talk about this load particularly, and the thing that people sort of misunderstand is that there's 900 grams of pasta there. It's about 2 pounds of pasta that I had for lunch alone. So that's more than most people would have at their pasta party, and that was just lunch. So that's some context there. You can see here, there's quite a few times I have bottle with Noon and CCD. Noon is obviously an electrolyte, and CCD is cyclic clustered dextrin. So a high density carbohydrate, very similar to maltodextrin in terms of flavorless, very easy to produce. I travel with a bag of it, and then I can get 80 grams of carbohydrates. I do that multiple times in a day usually. I try not to do that too much on race day -1 if I can avoid it, because it's just start peeing a lot. You sort of mess with electrolytes and fluid balance. So I do use it because it's an easy strategy. It doesn't taste like much. It's not particularly filling, but it may not be the best option there. but you can see it's all stuff I can get in where, well, pretty much stuff I already knew I'd be fine with. So drinks, yeah, food, cookies, bananas, bagels, etc., etc., etc. And again, when we get to race day, you'll see my race day breakfast is pretty standard again, because if you're traveling for marathons, it kind of has to be. You kind of have to have something if you're going to be on the road that you're pretty comfortable getting anywhere in the world. So you either carry, if you're going to travel, it's either carry what you're going to take, or it's have stuff that you know you're not going to have a problem with. And so you need to kind of stress test that as well. For context here as well, probably Scott and I should mention, we're probably on the heavier end of marathoners. We're both north of 80 kilograms, which means that our pure volumes of food are a lot higher, because if it's grams per kilogram, then it has to be quite high. So that's probably some context as well. There's most people on this call are not going to be eating 2 kilos or a kilo of pasta, 2 pounds of pasta, because it's probably not as necessary.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Dave, as well. Like if you then think about protein as well, if you're a 130-pound athlete or a 60 kilo athlete, 58 kilos if you're a female, maybe 65, 70 as a male, that total amount of protein and fat becomes a lot lower as well. And it's actually a lot more manageable. I think a couple of things I take out of this as well, and I think the way Dave's handled this is absolutely like fine for certain people. Some people like to have more control over what they're eating. And so what we tend to do with Fuelin is encourage people to practice along their training journey, their carb load as well. So they feel very comfortable and know how they respond firstly to a carb load, because I can tell you now, when you eat 900 grams of pasta, it's a pretty weird sensation on your body, and how you respond to that, how you respond to 90 grams or 80 grams of cyclic dextrin or maltodextrin, people will respond in different ways. So I think understanding what your carb load foods are is very important. And so for me, I know that I can get boiled white rice anywhere in the world. And that's what I feel very comfortable with. And I know I can get Greek yogurt. I know I can get blueberries. I know I can get sweet chili sauce, and I know I can get chicken. So for me, having practiced that, I know I could go Airbnb or a hotel and order that or cook it myself and feel very comfortable knowing that I respond very well to that. So that would be one of my big take homes, is practice your carb load, get very comfortable with what you feel best on, and then practice that a number of times, and then be ready to either take it, as Dave said, take it with you. Certain ingredients you might want to take, rice bubbles or Rice Krispies if you're traveling to Asia, for instance, you may not have any of that there. You're certainly going to be able to get rice, but you may not be able to get some of the cereals or bars. And in particular, things like RX bars, certain cookies, other things that David, the barbell salted peanut protein bar, you may want to pack that stuff with you so you feel very comfortable. But I think the other thing you take out of this is my carb load is very different from Dave's, but the purpose of it overall is to get total amounts of carbs. And as you see here with Dave was chasing 830. He may have got somewhere around the 8 or 9, and he did his damn best to get there as well, by the volume of food that he was eating, and he still fell potentially short. And so that's a good learning as well.
That I'll echo that. Just you've got to practice this stuff. If it's a B race or something like that, if you've never done this before, do not do this before your next marathon, because it doesn't feel the same, and you need to know what it feels like and feel confident. There's enough things going in your head on race day morning. You do not need to be worried about whether this was too much or too little or whatever. So, yeah. So this is carb loading glucose. I think this is something, so for context, Scott, you used a Libre, was it 3 or Libre 2?
Yeah, it was a Libre 3. So I was involved in a study that they're performing here at a university in Sydney. And so I was just a participant. So it's not a Super Sapiens monitor, but it is made by the same group, by Abbott.
Yeah. So the reason I bring that up, partially because we're not available in Australia, but more importantly, because data texture will look different. So the data will look a little bit different. It's fundamentally the same. So Scott's measurements will be in millimoles, as you can see here. And the multiplier is 18 to get to milligrams per deciliter, which is where my measurements are. Millimoles are used in most places in the world. milligrams per deciliter are used in the US, but it is a multiple of 18. So I'll have to do a bit of quick arithmetic in my head for a lot of this, but you can see here 3.92 is around 50 milligrams per deciliter and 10 is 180 thereabouts. So that's, you'll see those sort of measurements similar. We use a 200 as our top level and 55 is our bottom level. We have a range limit as well because we're not for use for people with diabetes, whereas Scott's monitor that he used obviously is, so it goes a lot higher and lower in that respect. But probably the one thing I'd say with carbohydrate loading, having done this a few times, looked at my data, looked at other people's data, and this is not a surprising thing, is, and you'll see this on Scott's data as well, is once you start carbohydrate loading, you'll notice the variability or the amount of sort of spikiness up and down that you see in these traces is increased. So it's, having looked at Scott's full report, this is the most variability he gets. He still has a pretty tight control, which is good to see, particularly given what he was eating. It's somewhat surprising, but at the same time, probably not, given he's really metabolically healthy. So the insulin gets a lot of bad name, or gets a bit of a bad rap in the world. It serves a purpose, and the purpose is storage. And in this case, it's exactly what you want. You want to be storing carbohydrates. That's the goal. So carbohydrate loading is, you want to store carbohydrates. So getting insulin release is probably a helpful thing in this context. And so, yeah, you can see here, it's a bit more variable than his normal trace is. Take my word for it on that. And then if you click the next slide, Scott, you'll see my carbohydrate load from our dashboard. So we have a sort of online portal dashboard that you can see here. You can see I've got a bunch of events created. This is probably one of our key value propositions, is that we create, that you can create events so you have context, because glucose data without context is really hard to understand and interpret. But looking at this, you can see it's a lot more spiky than Scott's, and that's a data resolution thing. So we've got minute by minute glucose. It's a lot, like there's a lot more sort of small resolution. It's also a zooming issue. So we've zoomed out a little bit, or we've zoomed in a bit, sorry. What you can see here, obviously sleep, everyone's interested in sleep, and we can talk about that at the end if you are still interested there. You can see I went for a bit of a run there, and you can actually see glucose increases that run, which makes a ton of sense when you've got a bunch of glucose that you've been putting into the system, and then you start running, your body will start to output that. Then you can see the food for the rest of the day. Again, I hit 180, which is 10, similar to Scott. I didn't go very low, similar to Scott, which makes a ton of sense here. If you look at the average there, and this is probably where the most interesting data is for people, my average glucose living day to day is around 101, 102 for most days on lower carbohydrate days, or days where I'm up and about moving around a lot, but not training much. It's maybe closer to high 90s. So you can see here it's 122. So unsurprising given the amount of carbohydrate I was putting in. And similarly, that glucose stability is a variability measure. So the lower is more stable. It's paradoxical. We won't get into it, but the lower values are more stable. Day-to-day living, I'll often have a stability, in the low teens or thereabouts. And this was 20. So you can see it. We've got two measures there that show you that, glucose or carbohydrate loading means you spike your glucose. So no one's surprised by that. Probably makes a bunch of sense, but we have data showing that now, which is cool to see. And this is a pretty consistent pattern, definitely in me and certainly in some of our athletes as well, that we see. I wouldn't be worried about it. Again, insulin is doing its job here. It's the goal. So
Dave, I guess one of the questions like some people will have is, obviously it's a lot more detailed, and you can see, and if we go back on mine, go back on mine, you can see obviously, I am pushing steadily, and it's obviously different because it's not zoomed in, but steadily pushing up around that 180, probably averaging, or what's 7 as an average? I presume that's the average there. 7 is.
Yeah, so 7's your average there. So that's 70.
Only like 130.
120, 130-ish. So similar to where I was for the day.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, people might say, well, that's not good for your health. Where do you sit on that? Like that, for these instances of, higher glucose, 7 millimoles, you're probably saying, if someone had that all the time, you're pre-diabetic or somewhere along those lines.
Sure.
How does this impact someone's health? Is it going to have negative implications? Do we know that yet or not around carbohydrate loading?
Well, I mean, observationally from a population level, you'd probably say that those people who partake in carbohydrate loading generally have lower glucose and less diabetes long term because of other factors. So I would say that if you were to say, I don't really care too much about performance, Should I still be carbohydrate loading? Can I get away without doing it? Like, probably can get away without doing it. I think a lot of things in health and performance we don't know the answer to, but I think in terms of decision making, what I usually say to people is you kind of need to understand where you lie on that spectrum of like, are you completely health focused, or are you completely performance focused, or where do you sit on that spectrum? Is it 55, 45, or is it something like that? Because I think the total number of marathons you should run in your life, if you want to be as healthy as possible, is probably zero. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't run marathons. That means that, perhaps some of the things we do are not as the best thing for our health long term, although they may be not so bad for it, right? It's like saying the total amount of alcohol you should drink in your life to be as healthy as possible probably amounts to zero. That doesn't mean drink none. That means that you need to make decisions with information. So is carbohydrate loading healthy? Probably not. Is it super detrimental? I don't think so. Metabolism's pretty, my take on it is it's pretty adaptable. So yes, you're going to have higher glucose for a day. You're going to have increased stability, but you'll actually see on the back end of this, here's a spoiler for later, like post marathon, you're a lot more stable and your glucose is a lot lower for a few days. So in the same way that you could say, it's
Well,
high
it's like
heart
the
rate.
second, it's like the second breakfast effect, isn't it? Or the second meal effect, sorry. So
Yeah.
like, does, as you said, a bit of a spoiler, but does
Yeah.
taking on high amounts of carbohydrates actually create some stability down the line? And we know that
Yeah.
with the second meal effect. If you skip breakfast, if you go really low at carbohydrates even overnight, and then you're having carbohydrates in the morning, I know from data that I've seen with you guys and also anecdotally speaking to athletes, they see this rather large blood glucose spike, and we've seen that in the research as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, look, I mean, my take on this is you're about to do a severe amount of exercise, and that carbohydrate is going to allow you to perform and ultimately, allow you to be healthy in that time and in that moment in time. So yes, I mean, you could argue that there's probably some acute inflammation going on and stuff like that, and there's always going to be acute inflammation after fairly intense exercise for a long duration. But I would, if I had to weigh it up, I would say for people, if you want to have a good marathon, I would absolutely advise on a proper and correct carbohydrate load and learn what works for you.
Yeah. And I would say when you say good, you're not just talking about performance, you're talking about experience as well. Cause it's like if
You'll
you run,
finish with a smile on your face, pretty much.
yeah, exactly right. Because if they can get pretty tough otherwise. So
Exactly.
here's my second day of carbohydrate loading. Again, pretty much a similar picture you can see there. Yeah, I don't need to labor the point too much. Bit spiky
Yep.
again, pretty high average and stability still quite
And
unstable, so to speak.
this was the day before.
I think
Um,
I think I might have one more day. Just double check. This might be the day
really.
before though.
And
Yeah, it's the day
so I think
before.
that's the day before. So you had at lunchtime, you had your big bowl of pasta, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly
What's
right.
interesting, again, look at the drop.
Yeah,
It's a normal physiological response.
yeah. I think that was some food. Just trying to think here. I think the second one is the pasta. I think what happened was I ate something, then we walked, then I got the pasta. So, and then I ate again, or I might have been drinking. I'd need to look at this. So one of the things, it speaks to our system. So I've got notes for some of these in there. So if I was on the dashboard here, I could look into that and see what I actually had. So I can write notes in there of what I had so that you have context for this. Because again, if I showed you this without events, you just got a bunch of spikes. You go like, I don't know what happened here. Was he running? Was he sleeping? What was happening? So I often use the corollary of heart rate data. Like if I just show you a 24-hour heart rate trace and don't tell you what's happened, there's no context. It's really hard to understand what that even means. So it's super important to have context with your glucose data as well, because some of these things are very normal. Some of them, if I was hitting 100 and these are not too bad, but if I was hitting say 200 without eating, question is like, okay, what's happened there? Is that stress? If that's stress, we're going to talk about what happened because there may be something there to manage. So yeah. Let's go on to race day. So this is race day. This is pre-race. Why don't you start, Scott, with your pre-race breakfast, and then we'll go on to me.
Yep. So generally speaking, again, what we emphasize with Fuelin is practicing race day breakfast, so you feel very, very comfortable with it on race day. Now, I my preferred race day breakfast is overnight protein oats. I make it in a mason jar. I take the dry oats, and I stayed at a friend's house, which was very close to the start of the race in Sydney. So I took my little jar of oats with maple syrup and everything else in it, and then just added milk in the morning, overnight, put it in the fridge, shook it, did that. So I got my 60 grams of carbs in there. I had a Morton bar about 25 minutes after that, which was still about 2 hours before. I also had a banana with that. 60 minutes before the race, I had two PF Precision Hydration 30 gels, caffeinated gels. So that gave me 200 milligrams of caffeine and 60 grams of carbs. That totaled 160 grams of carbs in the between that sort of 2 to 3 hours. Sorry, 3 to 1 hours before the race. Directly before the race, I about 10 to 15 minutes before, I have another 30 grams of carbs in the form of precision gel. And I take that. I don't tend to take anything between that hour and that 15 minutes before, just because of rebound, what we call rebound hypoglycemia, where if you do consume carbohydrates, some individual athletes will find that they get a pretty severe drop in energy. And that can be just because of blood sugars dropping over time, and generally speak happens in around that 30 to 40 minutes before a race. If you're starting to consume carbohydrates, that actually happens to me. So I tend to avoid carbs in that sort of period. And then we'll talk about the race carbs afterwards. Dave, I'll let you do your pre-race breakfast.
Yeah, actually, rebound hypoglycemia is a huge fear of mine. I also struggle to eat a lot on race day mornings. I've had rebound hypoglycemia. Ironically, I won't mention the product but by a company that's meant to be non-glycemic. I've had that having something from them and walking out the door shortly afterwards. So I get dizzy. I have to stop and walk. I get sweaty. It's really horrible. I've also had during a run taking something that was very high in carb. Again, I won't mention the company, but I took something and got really and since have not used that product again. But the point is, I wasn't sure about that stuff. I wasn't so sure why I was getting that, but once you see it on a glucose monitor, because you can see it using Super Sapiens or another CGM, it becomes very apparent. So as a result of that, we've got some data, like big numbers data, that looked at risk of rebound hypoglycemia. This is, again, it's not guaranteed, it's risk. And it's lowest if you're eating 3.5 to 4 hours before. And so that's why I did that. So my breakfast is 3.5 hours before. I tend to not eat a lot either. I run most of my time. I don't eat a lot before running most days. So I'm not super comfortable doing that. So I try and load up days prior and then just top up a little bit during, and then or morning of, and then go harder during the actual race. And that's sort of what I've done there. So you can see there, I hit about 1 gram per kilo. I also use coffee, not caffeine, because I just love coffee. But I do that coffee is 1 hour before. So I carry, it's usually for Boston, I had for some reason they let me take it on the bus. They shouldn't have, but it was a glass bottle of like a cold brew. For London, I took something as well, something similar. I brewed my own stuff and took it because I live in London, so to go there. But in Berlin, I grabbed a coffee on the walk to the race start. But I do an hour before I have a coffee, shooting for trying to get around 2 to 3 shots of espresso. So call that what you want. That's in and around somewhere around 150 to 200 grams. That's kind of my goal as well. But again, this food, if you look at that is available Boston, Berlin, London. If you do Chicago, New York, you wouldn't have a problem. Maybe Tokyo, you might have a problem there, but you could probably swap in that bagel for something else baked and be done. And again, super low fiber. I mean, maybe not the banana, but in general, pretty low fiber.
Well, and I think there's a couple of interesting things here. Obviously, you're actually a little bit heavier than me, but you look at the amount of carbs you took in on race day versus me. I took in nearly double you, but that's what I feel comfortable with, whereas what you feel comfortable with, and that's what you practice. And I think that's got to be the emphasis of this, is you've got to find as an athlete what you feel very comfortable with. I like eating a fair bit on race day morning because it makes me feel pretty good, but obviously it also stimulates my bowels. And I think that's also got to be something that, I know if I eat and also have some caffeine, it tends to stimulate. So I know that I'm good. 2 to 1 hour before, I know that I'm good and I've gone to the toilet. I'm not going to have that fear in the race. And I think, again, that is something that you can manage. And I'm sure you use caffeine or coffee for that reason. It often does stimulate the bowels and get you going. So finding what works for you is super important. And I can't stress that enough. The other thing I think that's really important as well, because a lot of people will shy away from, say, fiber on race day. And fiber is a form of, it's within carbohydrates. And carbohydrates have been found to be heat protective. So when the gut gets under heat stress, carbohydrates are your primary macronutrient that will provide some protection. And that is really important again for people, especially if you're racing in hot environments. Don't shy away from carbohydrates because they're actually going to be your best friend, which is another reason why going, say, keto or low carb, high fat, especially if you're racing in a hot environment, could actually result in fairly disastrous, situations. Worst case scenario would be something like endotoxemia, where you actually get blood poisoning as a result of, if you want to call it leaky gut or whatnot, but certainly larger proteins getting through the gut lining. So, carbohydrates aren't just for glycogen, they're not just for energy, they actually also help protect your gut lining. And I think that's a really important point for athletes to sort of get their heads around as well. Don't think about it's like protein. Protein's always thought about as, oh, it's just for muscle. And it's like, no, amino acids are pretty much involved in every cell in the body. So, think beyond just muscle, think just beyond glucose and glycogen when you are consuming carbohydrates. They help your bones, they help your immune system, they help with your gut lining, and they certainly help with energy.
Yeah, no, that's great. I
Um,
think
and
the only
then,
other thing
oh yeah, go on.
I was going to say the only other thing I'd say about bowel movements is like create a regular rhythm for yourself. Your body responds to rhythms. That will help you as well. Race morning, that is probably the key tactic I use, is try and like routine rhythm and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, which
On
plays
race,
into the whole, it plays into the whole like anxiety as well. And race day anxiety is a real thing, and that can
yeah,
obviously cause, absolute havoc for a lot of people's GI system. And so having your system can create a level of calmness as well that you may not realize, but that routine and that, like, okay, I can fall back on this meal because I've done it before. It creates a level of calmness, which ultimately can help you in other ways. Well, in terms of that anxiety, and that can have run-on effects to something as simple as your toilet habits.
yeah,
Dave, do you want to talk us through what you actually took in for the
yeah,
race?
yeah. So I use precision gels as well. Real simple for me. I take a gel at 10 minutes, 30 minutes, and 50 minutes every hour I'm running, basically. So as I start, it's at the 10-minute mark, the 30-minute mark, and the 50-minute marks every 20 minutes. I take 2 caffeine gels there at the 50 and 70-minute marks because that's about an hour before the finish, thereabouts. It sort of gives me some time with caffeine in the system, circulating caffeine levels being high towards the end of the race where you feel the most fatigue. It's also nice. That is my third and fourth gels, and they obviously caffeine gels for the most people who've had them. They taste very different, so they break up some of the monotony of otherwise the same flavor, whatever it is you're using. If you want to use Morton, you want to use Precision, like they all taste the same. So having the breakup of the caffeine is certainly there. I use as a result of that. Those who are familiar with Precision products would know that they have a 90-gram gel, which is great. Problem I have with that is that because I sort of take 2 caffeine gels, it means that I end up using the 30s mostly, unfortunately. But I do like that 90 gel, and I will use more of it. I've actually chatted to Andy and tried to get her to make a 90 gel that has some caffeine in it, 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams in it, so that I can use that. So maybe that'll come one day if you all put enough pressure on Andy.
I think they got some pretty cool products coming. So I also use Precision. I know Andy and the team, and they're great. So I use what they call their flow gel, which is 300 grams of carbs. And I carried that in a bottle, which, I would have preferred if it had a strap, because carrying a bottle is a pain in the ass and sort of makes your hand cramp, especially for 3 hours or whatever. So, but I took that on, and I think one of the things, the really important thing with this race is I understood through repeated sweat rate testing, which we do a lot of, and we emphasize a lot of this in Fuelin. So what we term sweat rate testing, so weighing yourself before and after sessions and documenting what you drink. I have a very high sweat rate. So my sweat rate when I'm running in temperatures over 30 degrees is about 1.6 liters per hour. So I knew this race was actually going to be around 34, 35 degrees Celsius. So it was going to be hot, and I knew that I was going to sweat a lot. So I had a specific strategy going into this, that at every aid station, I actually walked through them. So I would tip a water on my head, a water down my front, consume 2 drinks, and then pour another one over my head and another one over my body. So what we term whole body wettedness, which is an effective strategy to cool your body down. So I was aiming to take in around 200 mils at every aid station. And then also consuming sort of my gel leading into that. So I'd have the sip of gel, know how much, because I'd practiced that at that as well. And then go into the aid stations, wash that down with fluids, and then continue on. And that worked really well, knowing as the race obviously went through and got longer, it was getting hotter and hotter. And there was literally people, it was sort of like, as I described it, like Armageddon. There were people just falling over and collapsing as a result of heat stress and whatnot. So it worked very well. In terms of carbohydrate intake, again, what we term carbohydrate capacity within Fuelin. So athletes will log what products, how much they're consuming within their specific sessions, and work out, how many grams per hour they're consuming with what products and how they respond to that. And so over time, through repeated practice in training, you actually develop your race fueling strategy. And so again, I knew I fared best between 80 and 90 grams of hour. I'd worked that out based on the products that I was planning to use, in this case, Precision Gel and Morton Gel. And that's, again, going into the race, I had a plan. It wasn't like, okay, I'm just going to eat this and eat that and hope for the best. There was a very specific plan, exactly like, and I think I feed on the 20-minute mark. I have it on my watch. So at 20, 40, 60, I know my watch beeps. It tells me to eat, and I just do it. And I don't always want to do it, but I know I've got to do it. Even if I feel great, I will still take in that carbohydrate. If I don't feel great, okay, I might have a little bit and then try and get through it. But there's still that consistency in what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think
So yeah.
that's spot on. I think the only thing I'd say here, given we're talking about continuous glucose monitors, is, and it speaks to Scott's point, is like I practiced this 90 grams an hour with the caffeine gels and all of that for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks leading up to this in my specific long runs, and found that products that seemed to hold me a bit more stable. Both Morton and Precision held me very stable as the only two I've used for the last couple of years. I prefer Precision because they're 30-gram gels, not 25-gram gels. They also do that 90 gel, which is a little bit better. So I felt a bit better doing that. I feel that the 90-gram gel in an hour is a little bit better and a little bit more tolerable and a little bit more pleasant than 30-gram gels in an hour, because you can sip that 90 across the hour, and it would have been the same with you with the flow gel. You can sip that rather than taking a full hit of gel. So that's kind of just some little nuance there, but I certainly analyzed all that data. Definitely knew, that I would be good to.
I'm interested in trialing the M160, so the new Morton 40-gram gel,
Yeah,
because I think the nice thing about that, you potentially just have 2 gels per hour.
yeah,
And again, it just comes down to volume, practicing it, making sure you're really comfortable. But that's certainly something that you could look to do,
yeah, for
depending
sure.
on what you practice. And again, for me personally, I find the texture of the Precision Flow Gel a little bit easier to swallow than the Morton gel. It's just the texture and it's the palatability for me. But again, it comes down to individual preference. I think what we do know is that both products work very well because the way they're designed is based on the most, relevant research around carbohydrates and what's going to suit you best, which is ultimately maltodextrin and fructose as a combination.
Yeah. Right, let's get post race. So, sorry,
Oh,
this is
that's
race
your
day.
race day glucose.
Yeah, so this is race day. So you can see Scott's race day glucose, a little bit of a spike there, probably around the start, drops off a little bit. That's probably related to some anxiety or some excitement or whatever, adrenaline. A nice bump through the middle, and then starts to tail off there. So pretty common pattern. You can see his race day average there is a little bit lower than it was in his carb loading, probably because after the race he goes quite a bit lower, as you can see there, for the rest of the day. Knowing Scott, and certainly my what I do is after the race you definitely want something savory, you want some vegetables, you want all those things, so you tend to, and probably some fat, so you tend away from some of the carbohydrates, so it's no surprise you go a little bit lower there.
Dave,
Looking at,
can you say
yep,
my pointer? So I'd say
yep,
that's
yep,
12 o'clock where I am
yep,
there.
yep,
So I'd say that's where I finished the race,
yep, yeah, spot
probably
on.
about there. So, and it looks, if you actually look at yours, pretty similar.
Yep,
Like I imagine you finish somewhere around here and then it starts to
yeah,
drop off, and very similar. Yours is just more condensed and, that.
yeah. So you can see, I guess, for some texture on mine, you can see there I had my breakfast and then a huge drop afterwards, which is the thing that scares me endlessly. It came back to normal, obviously, and then you can see some anxiety getting to race day or getting to the start line. Then you can see start of the race, very similar to Scott there. We'll dissect my race on the next slide, but you can see post-race is a big spike. From memory, this is Berlin. I think that was an alcohol-free beer, and or when you finish the race, particularly if you do what I did, which is really sprint through the finish line, you can end up with quite a high glucose post-race. And then you can see I drop right down there to a basically unmeasurable. So that's clinical hypoglycemia. But I felt completely fine. And I think this is what we're starting to learn is with continuous glucose monitors is what I learned in medical school is that we were all really flat all day, and it certainly wasn't the case. We certainly see a lot more variability than that. You can see I actually take some time to refuel. I was not particularly hungry, so I didn't eat for a few hours. But you can see there when I do refuel, my glucose is a lot lower as a result. And that's kind of what we talked a bit about already. If you click the next slide, Scott, you'll see my race data overlaid with heart rate. So there's glucose, there's heart rate, there's elevation, and then there's pace as well. And I've removed power because run power just from my watch is not particularly helpful. So elevation there is the solid red line that sort of goes up sort of towards the 3/4 mark. Heart rate is the yellow line, and then the variably colored line, which starts out red and goes higher, is glucose. So you can see their initial little spike went out a bit hard, was a bit exciting. The Berlin start line sort of goes up and then comes back down to a bit of more of a normal level. So for context, I feel good. Above about 130, I feel really good. I can't speak to what that late little drop was there. So you can see right towards the end, I dropped down to about 120. I certainly didn't feel it and finished really strong, but there was a little bit of a tough patch, and you can sort of see there's a bit of a hill there later in it. It's not much of a hill. Berlin is pretty flat, but you can see my glucose goes a little bit down there, which is very normal, but I was struggling a little bit on that hill to feel good. That's around that 35, 38K mark. So right when it gets tough anyway. And then a couple of Ks later, I felt really good at the 39K mark and pushed on and actually ran really strong through the finish. And you can see the pace really picks up towards the end there in that down the bottom in that green line. But again, this is using our Training Peaks integration with sort of data overlay, so you can start to understand context for why you saw changes in glucose. Yeah. Alrighty, post-race. This looks completely different to pre-race. This is Scott's data. You can see here, it's basically flat as a tack now. It's a lot lower. It's a lot more flat. And you can see there, and this is what we see a lot of times post-race in like days following a race or with extended exertion. So something like a training camp or whatever, we often see glucose getting a lot lower, a lot more suppressed. And particularly overnight, we start to see this a lot less variable and a lot lower overnight, particularly. It's a bit of something we keep an eye on with athletes to talk about, are you fueling enough? What's training load like? Trying to disentangle those two, but ultimately they're sort of intimately linked there. But this is a very normal response. This is kind of what we talked about in the pre-phase, is that the need to bump up carbohydrates helps facilitate this lowering. So perhaps the two sort of cancel each other out to a degree, so to speak.
And the way that we structure it in Fuelin, that day one after a race will be considered a higher carb load, or a higher carb day, I should say. So the athlete will get a minimum of 5 grams per kilo body weight. They still take in around 2 to 3 grams per kilo body weight of protein, and fat will depend on total training hours for the week, but generally sit at about 1 gram per kilo body weight. So the athlete is certainly encouraged to refuel, even though they may not have a race for a very long time afterwards, and that week may be a very low week. The first few days after a race, the way that we structure it in Fuelin is that you are encouraged to eat and eat quite a lot. And for a lot of athletes, they always sort of ask, why is my day green? I just had a race. And it's like, well, you need to recover. And so don't always think that you're just eating food to prepare for something. You're also eating food to recover from something. And honestly, like, I mean, I didn't come out of the race feeling too bad, actually. And I do put that down to probably the volume of food and certainly carbohydrates and protein that I did consume in the leading up to it, but certainly afterwards, that I think I really did focus on, even on that Sunday evening, trying to make sure that I got in a significant amount of protein, although I didn't really want to take it in. I wasn't really feeling it.
Yeah, and your glucose is still quite flat as a result. So that speaks to the insulin sensing effect of the exercise. So
And that's exactly what we should say, isn't it? Like, you're taking in large amounts of carbohydrate, but your body is doing insulin is doing what it's meant to do. And that is, you would hope for majority of people doing a marathon that they have that sort of normal physiological response.
Yeah. Questions?
Cool. All right. I will stop
Please,
the
yeah.
share.
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions if you have them, or if there's any in the chat that's come through. Sorry, we didn't mention that before, but please feel free to ask questions or pop them through in the chat and we can answer them there.
And feel free to put your cameras on as well. I can see a familiar name there in Daniel Martin. Daniel, do you have any questions? You always have some good questions. If you're not on mute, and you are on mute.
I am on mute.
How you doing?
Good, how are you? Wait, where's my camera actually? I stopped it. I mean, I used Super Sapiens in the past as well. Maybe I've been a little bit overwhelmed on how to interpret the data. And data is nice until you know what it means and how to use it properly. For me, the question is rather, how can I use it, or can I basically see from the data when I should need to refuel, basically being on the bike, because while running, I typically don't see the data if I don't have the Super Sapiens band, but on the bike, I could see it. Is there any way to see, okay, that's a sign where you should refuel?
Yeah, we get this question a lot, and I guess some of it's to do with our initial marketing. There's another question here from Kelly. Can you tell how much fuel is in the tank? Like, you can't really, and that's because what you're visualizing isn't all of the glucose in the body. You're visualizing anything you've eaten that's glucose, like anything you're taking as a gel, or anything the liver is outputting. But any muscle glycogen stays in the muscle and acts in the muscle. So you don't see that in the bloodstream, and therefore you won't see it on a CGM, on a continuous glucose monitor. So in terms of things you'd be looking for, what I would say, and we're building a feature that may help with this, but in essence, at the moment, you're looking for glucose to behave as you would anticipate. So if you spike intensity, go over a hill, and maintain pace, what you should see is an increase in glucose probably. If you reduce pace, you'll probably see it go down like I did. Or if you, sort of, there's two components. There's the delivery and there's the output, and then there's the consumption of glucose. So if you have an increased consumption for something, you'll see glucose go down a little bit, but what you want to see is it sort of be relatively stable in that. What you want to try and avoid is low glucose states, particularly. So like below 80 is usually a line, depending on where you live normally. Now we do have some users who live at sort of in the high 80s, so that value isn't relevant for them. But someone like me who's 100, 110, like if I go below 80, that I generally feel pretty poorly. But that's something you've got to dial in over time. You kind of need to understand your own glucose behavior, understand where you feel bad. And then it's often more about rate of change. So are you seeing drops that are unexplained? It's not rolling over a hill. Because rolling over a hill, you stop using glucose will eventually start to go down. Like, that's fine. That's very normal. But is glucose going down when you'd anticipate it not going down? And is it going low and trending in a direction where you would hope that it wasn't doing that? So towards the end of the marathon, if you're starting to see it trend down and you've still got 5 kilometers to go or something like that, you've still got half an hour of running. Okay, now maybe we need to fuel up a bit more. I need to think about why that's happening. Was my carb load proper? Because some of this stuff is fundamentally, if you're half an hour from the finish line, there's not a lot you can do. Like, you're going to mouth rinse with some carbohydrates, maybe take a gel, but like that's not going to have a huge effect. So it's kind of then looking back at, what did I do wrong? Did I pace wrong? Was my carbohydrate load right? Was my pre-race food right? What happened there that affected things later in the race? Because in a marathon, it's mostly a pacing issue. Yes, you can get nutrition wrong. Like, if I'd seen a drop in my glucose that was abnormal or something like that, I would have really questioned, was my, like, especially given I'd done so much work looking at 90 grams an hour, as like, was my pacing wrong? Did I burn too much carbohydrate early? Is that what's really made a mistake? Or was that where the mistake was? Should I have done something different in that respect? So that's kind of how I'd approach it. But it's just like saying, I use heart rate all the time. Like, heart rate can kind of tell you've made mistakes at the time. It's more feedback than it is feed forward. It's not going to tell you that like, there's anything that you can really change going forward. You've kind of made the mistakes already. So just like I wouldn't pace a race to heart rate only, I would probably not base a full fueling plan only on CGM. I would use CGM to give you feedback, inform it, understand it. And then on the day, just like on a day, if I'd seen a really high heart rate early, I would have considered why. I would say the same thing of glucose. If you're seeing really low glucose early, the question is why. So that's probably the big thing.
Yeah, Dave and Dan, I'll just add to that. I think what Dave said there is, I think it's the day-to-day stuff where you're going to see sort of the impact of what you're doing. But I think in real time, like, and I know it is a real-time CGM, but I think when you're in that moment when you are training and you're actually practicing taking in that, and it's going to be a time thing. You're going to have your cadence that you take that fuel in to hit that number that makes you feel best. And then you can probably retrospectively look at that and look at the numbers and see whether you're dropping in that. But I mean, I can certainly, and I know you from working with you, but like, you're not going to be looking at a number going, oh, I can hold off taking, 30 grams of carbs here at 20 minutes because my levels look good. I'd be like, well, as Dave said, we don't know what your glycogen levels are doing. We're only looking at interstitial fluid at this point in time. And so we want to keep adding carbohydrates, that exogenous carbohydrates on top. And, what you do in training is going to, play into the race. And I think it's another data point that you can look at through training and see how you respond to that fueling during that training and day to day. That's where I think you're going to get the most use out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that it's a magic pill or the holy grail, like a fuel gauge that tells you exactly when and how to refuel, but understanding the data and what you said, okay, well, I consumed X amount of carbs and I felt great or I felt shitty. That's valuable data still, yeah, but it's not like what I said, yeah, it tells you exactly you need to fuel now this X amount to perform best. Yeah. That's it. I think that's biggest takeaway.
And that was actually I remember years ago when first tried Super Sapiens. I remember that was my initial hope. Was like, oh wow, we'll be able to like really like be able to see when you should need to eat something, and that's going to be amazing. Like we literally, but it didn't really work out like that. It didn't translate quite into that way. So I think now it's like repurposing and working out how you use that data to be effective in your fueling strategy.
No, absolutely.
Cool.
No, thanks.
Was it Tracy who asked that other question I saw?
No,
Does that answer your question, Tracy?
That was Kelly, but
Kelly, was it?
Yeah.
Cool. That answer your question, Kelly?
Yes. Yeah. I was so I just recently started using a continuous glucose monitor, but only because I'm a type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic. And so it was just some information I had, and I just recently did a first Ironman event. So
Congratulations.
started using the CGM after the Ironman event because on the lead up to Ironman, apparently I had consumed way more carbs in my training and racing to where my A1C levels were high. So all of a sudden I've become very interested in how to use CGM to manage my blood glucose levels, but also to optimize race performance at the same time. So now in this coming year, I have a bunch of 70.3 races coming, and I'm trying to understand how do I manage my A1C levels while optimizing race performance. So that's why attending this webinar was very important in terms of trying to just learn anything about how to optimize my performance. So yeah, so when I was asking about fuel in the tank, part of that is this fine balance. How do I only take in the amount of carbs I need and not too much?
Yeah. It's again, like it kind of gets back to that point I made around needing to understand like how performance versus health oriented you are, like where that balance sits, because there's like you have to balance that to some degree, right? Because we are talking about your health as well. So that's part of it. And that might be day to day, week to week, you put the emphasis there, and then on race day you let go or whatever it is. But I'd say, yeah, it's probably the big thing. And then it's about ensuring diet quality around that. Because like if you talk about pre-diabetes, like diet quality is going to have a huge impact on that. And then all the other lifestyle behaviors, stress management, sleep, your exercise, hoping you're doing enough given you're training for 70.3s. I assume you're not, slouched there. So those are the big levers we can pull. And and certainly there are factions of the world who might consider carbohydrate restriction in that. I'm not convinced it's as essential, but I do think that, you know, if you can address the other pillars of lifestyle, sleep, nutrition, etc., you'll do really well for that.
Yeah, Kelly, I will say, obviously, in your case, you know, there is I guess a disease process prevalent, so it's not like a typical. What we're talking about is you know, a typical response to carbohydrates based on our metabolic health. And in your case, your metabolic health is potentially compromised. And so what I have seen, we have registered dietitians as well and registered nutritionists working within Fuelin. And I know Dr. Alan McCubbin, who's one of our registered dietitians, who is a fellow of Sports Dietitians Australia. He's worked with a number of type 1 and type 2 diabetics who are training for 70.3 and Ironman, and help them manage their carbohydrate intake on a day-to-day basis, and as well as their training and racing to optimize health and performance. And it does look, I would say to you, like, and I'm sure you're getting help already, but certainly lean in on experts who understand your disease and help you get the most out of it. Don't always try and figure it out yourself, because it is complicated. And there are people out there that do know what they're doing and can certainly save a lot of time for you.
Another question from Mariana. Thank you for this. Have we observed abnormalities in glucose levels when athletes consume more glucose fructose than they were able to absorb? For example, more than 100 to 120 grams an hour. Certainly not acutely on a CGM. I mean, it's one reason super high levels that you may not necessarily need, as opposed to not absorbing, because that's a separate thing. But stuff you may not need, you may see really high glucose after the event, is one thing you may see, although there's other reasons for that, as I mentioned in my own data. You can't really tell if you aren't absorbing stuff on that, aside from, okay, maybe you'd have to sort of triangulate symptoms. So you'd have taken 120 grams an hour. For some reason, you've got really low glucose, despite not necessarily having as the output you might have considered. And then you've got GI upset. Like that's when I would say maybe you've taken in stuff and not absorbed it. Because like the big thing that you'll find with non-absorption is that it creates GI upset. It pulls there, it draws water, you get really, get sick, get diarrhea, etc., etc. So I'd say that's probably the big way you'd tell that. I tend to think of glucose as like, it'll only tell you if you haven't had enough, really. Like that's probably the only thing you're really going to tell from it in like post-event is like, have I not had enough, or has there been some other issue? It's not going to tell you you've had too much. It's not going to, there are many reasons. There are so many factors that affect glucose that there are probably 5 or 10 that I would say before you've had too much during that are going to cause high glucose after the race. It's probably my take on that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that everyone should also appreciate is not every athlete needs 90 to or 120 grams of carbs per hour. Power output does play a role in this, certainly on the bike. So if you've got an FTP of say 160 watts, you're not needing the same as one of the top level pro female or male who may be consuming, upwards of 90, 120 grams an hour. So your pace and your power will play into this as well. And I think, as Dave said, like simply probably in terms of absorption, okay, you could do some testing, but simply being if you've got lower GI distress, i.e. you end up with diarrhea or certainly abdominal cramping, or upper GI issues, which could be related to gastric emptying, where you start burping and potentially vomiting, then that's probably going to tell you you've taken in too much carbohydrates for what your body actually requires. And that's probably very simplistic, but very practical for you to start to understand. Now, that doesn't I guess the caveat to that is if you've never taken on carbohydrates during training at the intensity that you're running, often you'll have to start with very low amounts, but your gut, your stomach, your intestine, everything like that can be trained like any other muscle, and you can build up the ability to take on more carbohydrates and build up that resilience over time. So it is always, as again we emphasize, this is about practicing carbohydrate intake in training in specific sessions, i.e. at run pace or above, race pace or above, and using those sessions, certainly when there are adequate duration, if you are training for a marathon, I'm sure you're going to be doing plenty of sessions that go over 80 minutes, then you are practicing taking in carbs during those sessions. Don't shy away from taking carbs in training. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we see. And one of the most noticeable comments we get with Fuelin is people are like, you want me to consume carbs during my training? And then they start doing it and they start recovering better. They feel better during the session. And it's often a game changer, but it's also a game changer to how you respond to that and how you feel. And so just, you know, it is a balancing act. There's no recipe for this. Like, yes, we can talk, and science is showing, you know, higher amounts of carbohydrates are resulting in, you know, improved power output and run speeds and whatnot. But to get to that level, they are very, very high performing athletes, and not everyone is in that category. So you need to work out what actually works for you. And that's just a process that you do over time.
Yeah. Just double clicking on the like taking enduring at pace, swallowing stuff while you're running, or like probably running is much more of a variable than cycling, but like at race intensities are a lot more difficult than people think. Breathing, swallowing, all that stuff, not coughing it up, like the classic being drinking water. So what I would say about all of that is practice it in training as close as you can to what you'll do on the race day. You know, Scott walked through water stops, which I think is really wise. I've coughed and choked on a number of bits of water when I'm trying to drink them during a race. So like that is hard. And the faster you go, it's not about relative pace, it's about ultimate pace. The faster you are going, the harder that is. So
Yeah.
if, you know, it's harder for a 2-hour 30 guy than it is for a 3-hour guy or a 3-hour girl or, you know, 340. So all that stuff is super different. So certainly that is a skill.
Yeah. And don't be afraid. Like, you know, obviously my time was nowhere near Dave's, but you know, it was 229, I wish. 329, but I did walk through because it was extremely hot. And so you can still get a decent, you know, marathon time even by walking through and pacing yourself. And certainly that's very applicable to Ironman. And if you saw Chelsea Sodaro win in Kona, she walked through a lot of the aid stations and still ran an incredible marathon time for that race in high heat. So again, it's pacing, it's strategy, it's practice. Something we often do, and for those of you, whether you're a marathon or you're doing half Ironman or Ironman, you know, using out and backs. So you might set up a little aid station outside your house or in a park, and you might go, if you know that every aid station is every mile or every 2 miles, and you know that you're going to be using that because that's what you've worked out, you know, you go out potentially half a mile and you come back, and then you go through and you have your products. Or it might be every 2 miles. So you're out for 1 mile, back in a mile, and on your little station, you've got water, you've got gels, you've got your, you know, Red Bull, Coke, whatever it is that you anticipate getting in the race. And that's all just practice, and that's just training, and that's just being prepared. It's all I guess the reality is everyone likes to talk about the science and all that, but at the end of the day, you got to get it into you. And if you can't get it into you, it's all the science in the world is worth nothing. So a lot of this is practicality, and I can see Dan shaking his head because, you know, that's something that he's really come to terms with. It's the practicalities of taking in, you know, especially when you do get up into the higher amounts of carbs, it is the practicalities of that.
I mean, for me, the biggest experience was during a half marathon where you run closer to threshold than you are running in a 70.3 or in a marathon. And even though I practice consuming carbs, doing 3x8 at threshold in practice, it's a different thing if you're at the 50-minute mark trying to consume carbs, running a threshold where you're basically, I mean, you're done. Yeah? You just want to finish the bloody race, and you're crawling more or less. So it's a different animal. So for me, the biggest takeaway is to really practice it at the end of tough sessions to really be able to consume it, because it's a different thing if you're 20 minutes into a threshold session or 60 or 80 minutes in a threshold session.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
I'd concur with that. You know, nothing's ever easy at the end.
Yeah.
So practicing that is a good idea.
So particularly,
it's important to consume it until the end and not just finish by then, because then the man with the hammer is waiting for you. That's guaranteed.
yeah, particularly we could distance a half marathon because the elites probably get away without doing too much fueling or none at all because they finish in an hour. For the rest of us mortals, it's a funny time because you're running really fast and it's really hard, but also yeah, you have to take some stuff.
Yeah.
So
You have to take on something, but not
Yeah.
too much. I guess that's the good thing as well. So,
Yeah.
the only other thing I would say, I think it was it Mariana who asked about Mariana asked about the glucose fructose. I guess this also comes down like, if you are in that 60 gram sort of an hour level, you may not need multiple transportable types of carbs. So you may not need glucose and fructose as well. And that could be a consideration, because if you're taking on, those mixed carbs and you actually don't require any more than 60 grams, that could be a cause of your GI distress as well. You may just do very well on maltodextrin or glucose. So something to consider as well. And you may want to see how that looks on something like a CGM, and how you respond to glucose only or maltodextrin versus a combination.
Yeah,
Cool.
thank you. Fully agree with you.
Yeah, that's cool. Does anyone else have any other questions? Good. Okay.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everybody, and thanks, Scott, for hosting the webinar and having me along. And yeah, if you haven't listened to the episode we had with Scott, please do. It was a great episode. Gave us a bunch of knowledge, talked about a bunch of stuff. Scott will be happy to hear as well. I spoke to Alex Coates late last night, my time. So that'll be out on Monday. So we're talking to Alex Coates about some overtraining in CGM in her study. And so, yeah,
Excellent.
we've managed to get her on the podcast. She's got some good stuff to say, Scott. I think you'll be enjoying it. So
yeah, that'd be great. Mate, thanks so much, and appreciate your time. I know it's early morning over there, so we'll say goodbye to everyone, but thank you all for joining, and thank you for your time.
thanks all.
Thank
Bye.
you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Nice. I will hit stop. Where is stop? Down the